also join the Commonwealth Observer Mission. Mr. Thabo Mbeki is addressing the press.
Observer Mission, and I see Ambassador Mohammed Ibn Chambers from the UN Mission for West Africa, and thanks for coming. The Commonwealth Observer Group has been present in Ghana since the 29th of November, and our arrival was preceded by an advanced observer team which has been in the country since the 16th of November. And we've met with the Electoral Commission, with the presidential candidates, the political parties, with civil society, including women's and youth groups, media representatives, the police, the Commonwealth High Commissioners, as well as other national and international election observer missions. And on the 4th of December, our teams were deployed throughout the 10 regions of Ghana to observe the election environment and the preparations for the polls. And ahead of election day, our team met the electoral officials, the political parties, that is in the regions. Our teams, the political parties, the police, other stakeholders at the district and regional levels, to gain a comprehensive picture of the electoral processes and the environment at those levels. And therefore, our teams observed the final campaign events around the country. And the following an initial assessment of the critical aspects of the election process and the electoral environment. And our final report, which we will complete before our departure, will be issued at a later date. As the Commonwealth Observer Group, we commend the people of the Republic of Ghana for the orderly manner in which they exercise their right to vote on the 7th of December. And in our briefings with several stakeholders, we were informed that the atmosphere at the campaigns was vibrant and largely peaceful, with a few incidents of violent clashes between the two main political parties. And the campaign rallies of the major political parties were highly visible in various parts of the country. And however, we were also informed about the use of vigilante groups or the presence of some vigilante groups apparently attached to some political parties. The final campaign rallies of the two leading political parties were held in Accra, with their campaign paraphernalia, including billboards, posters, and supporters clad in party colors, being highly visible. And the other political parties had a lower level of visibility, but we note that these final rallies were peaceful overall, and the fundamental rights of all the candidates of the political parties and supporters to assemble and campaign were broadly respected. The campaign was highly competitive and closely fought between especially the leading political parties, and the local peace efforts by the National Peace Council and its partners are to be commended for bringing together the presidential candidates to sign a peace pact known as the Accra Declaration on the 1st of December. And at the signing of the peace pact, the presidential candidates declared their commitment to peace and to put the democratic aspirations of Ghanaians above all other considerations. And we commend the peace messages that were conveyed ahead of the elections by several groups, including civil society groups, the citizen observers, and the youth. On the media, we believe that freedom of speech and expression is indeed enshrined in the Ghana Constitution, and it has led to a proliferation of media institutions, in particular radio. And stakeholders informed our group that both public and private media in Ghana have, in some cases, reported events inaccurately, especially those which have not been in favor of their respective sympathizing party. And there's been growing concern that a lack of regulation has led to unsubstantiated claims and counterclaims by some reporters. And stakeholders also expressed concerns about the use of inflammatory language particularly on radio. Overall, however, it was found that journalists acted responsibly and that the media was balanced in its coverage. And on the issue of the social media is growing rapidly in Ghana, with a 40% growth in the last year, 14% growth in the last year. This has in the main been driven by young people who make up more than half of the population. And as such, the use of Facebook, of Twitter, of WhatsApp, and other online media has become an increasingly important means of communication during the election campaign. And on the revised legal framework, the Ghana's 2016 general elections were conducted under a revised legal framework as a result of reforms implemented since the previous election. And new provisions for these elections included a requirement for election officials and party and candidate agents of candidates to take oaths before a magistrate or a judicial officer. It provided for the provision for the adjournment of polling in the event of a disruption, for serially numbered statement of polls and declaration of results sheets, for sanctions in the law for election officers who negligently perform their work, for the introduction of manual verification of voters, supplementary to biometric verification, and a requirement for returning officers to use copies of collation sheets to candidates, to issue copies of collation sheets to candidates and party agents, and for the expansion of the list of special voters to include accredited media and security personnel, as well as staff from the Electoral Commission. We had the opportunity to observe the special voting on the 1st and the 4th of December, and this initiative on the whole was a success with a turnout of close to 80%. However, we received complaints that a fair number of voters who expected to cast their votes under this arrangement were unable, for various reasons, to locate their names on the special voting lists. But we commend the efforts of the Electoral Commission, the security agencies, and the political parties who quickly met to address the challenges that were encountered. And we welcome the setting aside of a second day for the continuation of the special voting and the decision to deploy affected officials close to where they were registered to enable them to exercise their franchise on the main polling day, that is December 7th. Now, with regard to the election day, the main election day, we observed and were credibly informed that the majority of the polling stations opened on time, with the polling staff, education material, security, and party agents present. The exception, of course, was Jaman North, a constituency in Brong-Ahafo region, where voting took place yesterday because there had been a dispute about the voters' register. Where there were delays, these were reportedly caused variously by the late arrival of polling staff, of security personnel or party agents, or the delay in the availability of the necessary voting equipment. But for the most part, the setup of the polling stations was adequate, though in some cases the positioning of the voting booths was such that the secrecy of the vote may have been compromised in some instances, though these would have been very few. And the majority of the polling stations were accessible to persons with disabilities. And in terms of the polling stations that we actually visited, we noted that a significant number of polling staff were female, though the majority of the presiding officers were male. With regard to the voting process, voting for the most part followed the prescribed procedures. Voters requiring assistance, including pregnant women, the elderly, those with disability, were given preferential treatment at the polling stations. The majority of voters found their names on the voters' list and were able to vote. On the whole, relatively few incidents were reported, that is a significant impact on the voting process. At the close of the polls at 1700 hours, the majority of the polling stations had no queues. The counts in general followed the prescribed procedures, and this included the signing by the party agents of the results declaration forms and the posting of the official results in a visible and public place for the public to view. And our overall conclusion is that the opening, voting, closing, and counting processes at the polling stations on 7th of December were credible, transparent, and inclusive. We commend and congratulate the Ghanaian voters, the Electoral Commission, and the polling staff, the political parties, the citizen observers, the citizen observers, the media, and the security forces for their respective roles in ensuring the success of the electoral processes thus far. We are mindful, however, that the process of collating the result is still going on, and our final assessment of the entire process will be contained in our final report. It is our hope and expectation that the positive, peaceful, and orderly atmosphere that all of us experienced on the 7th of December will continue to prevail as we await the conclusion of the electoral process. And in this regard, we urge all parties and candidates to allow the Electoral Commission to announce the results of the elections, as well as respect the will of the people of Ghana as expressed at the polls once those results have been announced. In the spirit of the Accra Declaration signed last week, we appeal to all Ghanaians to refrain from making any utterances or performing any acts that could trigger tensions or otherwise adversely affect the post-election environment. And furthermore, if any disputes should arise concerning the elections, this should be settled through the prescribed legal channels. Finally, it is our hope that by bringing this electoral process to a successful conclusion, Ghana will again serve as an inspiration and beacon for the rising tide of democracy throughout the Commonwealth. And I thank you very much for listening. It was said that members of the press might want to ask 1.5 that gentleman standing there.
Thank you, David, for the Financial Times. I wanted to ask a much broader question that maybe some journalists here they also will ask you about Ghana. I wanted to ask you a broader question about the state of democracy.
About
the state of democracy in Africa. Some people argue that democracy is less important than development, and they might point to Rwanda or Ethiopia. Others might say, even when you have democracy, if the elections aren't credible, and they might point to various countries, Gabon, I might name, then what's the point? And then, of course, you do have still several countries in Africa where you have, presidents who've stayed on practically for their whole life, 20, 30 years. But there are other developments as well, Gambia, etc., etc. I did Nigeria last year. I would be very interested to hear your opinions on the worth of democracy.
All right, so that's Mr. Thabo Mbeki there, seated with other observers from the Commonwealth Observer Mission, addressing the press and giving a brief of their observations so far, which is very detailed, really. They describe the media coverage of this election as balanced and generally journalists behaving well. Also significant is the observation of collation and declaration of the results as they happened. He described it as credible, transparent, and inclusive. You're on your election headquarters.